I don't mostly always forget. Maybe next time. Anyway, I'm interested in organizing principles that are applicable to psychotherapy. For instance, there's a couple that fell to pieces. They had an emergency yesterday, and she was divorcing him and everything. And so I said, okay, look, you guys, this is going to be a tough session. Are you willing to have a tough session? And they both agreed. I said, so you guys have huge blind spots. You get distressed, and all you can see is your pain and their responsibility. And you're smart, so you have intellectual thoughts about your responsibility and their pain, but it's disappeared psychologically. They went, oh, yeah, that's great. So then they started talking, and I interrupted after 30 seconds. I said, you just did it. And then the other person started, you just did it. And that organizing principle got through to them. They were interrupting themselves by the end of the session. I am still high from that session because there was an organizing principle that had an impact that hopefully will continue to. Anyway, I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in the interplay between our evolution, our biology, our neurobiology, our developmental biology, our developmental psychopathology, and psychotherapy. And as everybody knows, I think that the dialectic is kind of the peak of human capacity for relating, and that informed people at Thiel or higher engaging in the dialectic, particularly with the purpose of understanding or enhancing the human condition, is a metapsychology, is a turquoise psychology. And I think that therapists tend to operate at a Thiel level, reaching for the dialectic with their clients again and again and again and again. Also, parents do this. And there's organizing principles that go back a long way. And they don't just have to do with our biology, and they don't just have to do with our neurochemistry, and they don't just have to do with our history or our cultural surrounding. They have to do with all those things simultaneously. And so I wanted to talk about that today, ending up with how it gets enacted in the psychotherapy session and how that relates to parenting, leadership, and culture. So there you go. And I'm going to do a little exercise too. And we'll do that for a while. Unfortunately, Abigail has to leave at 11, so hopefully she might leave before we do the exercise. So just, in a way to review, everything is relationships. All right, so there it is. And we're a pair bond species. And in relationships, at least in human relationships, we have incredible capacities for intersubjectivity. And the way it works neurobiologically is you develop the neurobiological territory, and then you develop the capacities to grow into it. Human beings have capacities for incredible superpowers when it comes to intimacy and the dialectic, and not to mention all the psychic stuff. And the territory is largely there, and we can grow into it. And when we grow into it, that then alters the territory. Your neurobiology changes. For instance, if you engage in the dialectic in a way that you haven't before, 8 weeks later, your brain is different. This is especially relevant for parenting, of course, because we want to help our kids develop good brains. And it's relevant for psychotherapy because in psychopathology, personality disorders don't have certain circuits. And, you have to install those circuits, help them do it, which, is difficult, but possible if people are interested. And the way that this is all formed is it goes back to the pair bond. 5 million years ago, when we came down into the savannas, a guy had to be willing to die for his wife and his kids, and that created an asymmetrical hierarchical system, parents, kids. And in that system, there were two different kinds of hierarchies. There were the growth hierarchies and they're always both happening to some extent. Growth hierarchies where people are being encouraged to be more purely themselves from their heart outward, from an almost standpoint, unobstructed development of soul in relationship with other souls. And dominance hierarchies where people are pushing each other around and dominating each other. And this is basically these asymmetrical hierarchical relationships based on the pair bond, created the tribes, and basically are at the basis of all human groups to this day. And we know that how people enact those things depends an awful lot about their social surround. And that's a big deal. And the interplay between that and who people are biologically and who people are our families kind of determines how we grow. And particularly, you can look at development through the different value memes. And there's different kinds of discourse that happens. Corey did this. He said he made them all D's, so it was easy to remember. So there's dictate at red, there's doctrine at blue, there's debate at umber, there's dialogue at orange, there's discourse at green, and then there's the dialectic at teal. But you have to be in a culture that can sustain your level of discourse. Which brought me to social research. And I'm going to quote some social research from Kurt Lewin and Diana Baumrind. Miriam, you know Diana Baumrind's work? Yeah. All right. So in the 30s, Kurt Lewin had to leave Germany because of the Nazis. He's Jewish. He and his wife made it out. His sister and his mother couldn't get visas. They died in the death camps. And Kurt Lewin apparently was this very charismatic, warm, beautiful guy. Margaret Mead just adored him. She was one of his students. Probably slept with him if he was available, but he probably wasn't. He seemed to be dedicated to his wife. That's not a hit on Margaret Mead. She just liked to sleep with the people she really liked a lot. And I just find that an endearing fact about her life. Anyway, he was very, very charismatic. And at that time, he was pushing back against the existentialist psychiatrists who were saying, the Germans have this authoritarian thing in them, and that's it. They have this kind of a genetic thing. Eric Fromm, those kinds of guys. And he said, I don't think so. And I'm going to show it. So he took a bunch of kids, a bunch of boys. During those decades, they always experimented on boys. And even the Milgram experiments, when they taught people to shock other people, or when they did the prison experiments at Stanford, it was all guys. Anyway, he took a bunch of 11-year-old boys and taught them art. He had 3 different groups. One group was what he called the democratic group. Democratic group was there was a leader who said, okay, this is the rules, but it's all open. If anybody has an opinion, they'll talk about it, and we'll kind of find something that feels fair to all of us. And so the standard of the democratic group was basically a growth hierarchy standard with a leader. And the leader part of it is a big deal. Remember, we were born, raised, we're wired to be in hierarchical systems. When we will go into a room, we'll notice where we fit into the social hierarchies of that room. And if we're being treated as if we're not at the level we think, we'll get distressed. Okay? One of the reasons that this group feels good is everybody feels respected and cared about, recognized, and honored by everybody else. Okay, so that part of us is at peace. So that was the democratic group, and those kids did better. They had half as much conflict as the other kids. They learned more art than the other kids. And when the leader had to leave, they generally continued the work. The other group was an authoritarian group. So the leader said, this is the way it is. That's what we're going to do, and that's it. Not sadistic, but authoritarian. Those kids were twice as hostile. When the leader left, it tended to erupt. When the kids got up, they were very competitive. When the kids got upset, they tended to turn on one kid, scapegoat him, drive him out of the room. And then everybody would relax after they had successfully attacked another person. That was the authoritarian group. Then there was another group that was the permissive group, a disengaged leader, and they just were chaotic. Okay? Now, this work, as we talked about, the famous Robbers Cove work that was done by Sharif later on, which demonstrated you could take groups of boys and teach them how to be competitive and teach them how to be cooperative by adjusting life conditions. And, we can all see how this is anticipating spiral dynamics. Life conditions dictate worldview. And so they created different life conditions and they got different worldviews out of these kids. And what they found was that the Democratic group did better. Not surprising. It certainly does fit with modern UN happiness research. Well, how does that happen? You know, Lewin kind of skated over what those Democratic leaders were like on the group. And that's a big deal. You know, all of us do work with people. All of us know the difference between having an effective and responsive facilitator or leader and not. And they have certain characteristics. And those characteristics, again, are going to model that asymmetrical hierarchical system of the pair bond in the family. And so, let's look at parenting. Well, there's this woman, Diana Baumrind, extraordinary woman, a Berkeley professor in the 50s and 60s. Not an easy thing for a woman to do. You know, it's sexist United States. I guess everybody was sexist in the 50s and 60s. But anyway, she wanted to look into parenting. So she took 100 families and studied each of them over 15 years and did 50 hours of observation with 100 families. I mean, that would cost tens of millions of dollars today to do a longitudinal research like that. She wanted to know what's the better and worse forms of parenting. Now, I'm gonna push her research together because there was a developed. First, she found 3 different forms, then somebody else added a 4th form, and then she added a refinement. I'm not going to go into that, but basically, she found here are the forms of parenting that I found, and I won't bury the lead. The most effective one was called authoritative parenting. Now, what she looked at was basically firmness and warmth. She called it demandingness and responsiveness, firmness and warmth. Authoritative parents were firm. You know, there's certain standards that they insisted on in the family, but they were responsive, they were warm. And later on, she found out that if they're flexible, firm, warm, and flexible, that's ideal. Firm, warm, and flexible, she called that harmonious parenting. Kids had better scores, more self-regulation, better social engagement, less psychopathology. Across the board, authoritative parenting, better. Authoritarian parenting, high on firmness, high on demandingness, low on responsivity. Okay, those kids were shut down, tended to be anxious and have problems. Oh, then there was permissive, high on responsiveness, very low on firmness. Those kids tended to have impulse control problems. They were more at risk to have drug and alcohol problems in adolescence. And the worst one was disengaged, where they just didn't present like they cared that much. Those kids, more psychopathology. Now, there is a blind spot in her work. There's the same blind spot that the attachment people have had. The same blind spot to a certain extent that Chess and Thomas had with the goodness of fit research. They weren't taking into account the personalities of the children. When a baby is born, from the moment they're born, they are shaping the environment as much as the environment is shaping them. So 15 and 19% of the population doesn't have the circuits for productive self-awareness or self-regulation and is wired for some kind of personality disorder. Those kids tend to evoke permissive parenting because parents give up on them, you know, and trying to get them, so they just give them what they want, which supports narcissism, of course. Or if they're borderline and they're angry and they're challenging, they tend to create authoritarian parents. Okay, they're co-creating. It's not just the parents.
It.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question regarding the baby born, since it's born, it's developing personality? Because so I understand that children, perhaps until 6 months, it's in totally fusion. It's totally in this undifferentiated connection and flow with the environment and everything. So how does it happen to create this individuality as the experience is totally meshed and integrated, so it's totally unconscious, and actually there is a fusion? So how how it happens that it's creating individuation since this first
Well,
moment.
so not to get too lost in the weeds here, um, part of it has to do with the last trimester. How a mother deals with stress in the last trimester will set up the kid's system around dealing with stress. If she is able to regulate cortisol down, 30% of that migrates into the placenta. And if her cortisol goes up and down because she's good at self-regulation, the kid is going to have a better time. But even more, 75% of personality is heritable. An infant taken away from a mother and then bonding with another mother will develop the same personality than if they're being raised by their biological mother. So it's not a tabula rasa. It's the capacity for the child's system connecting neurobiologically with the mother system that then co-creates the personality in the kid. But there's certain things that are deeply embedded in their genetic predisposition. And the personality disorders are deeply embedded. That doesn't mean that we can't heal from them. We can heal from all of them. So that fusion that you're talking about is an interplay between the biology of the child, the biology of the mother. When a baby's born, they've got 85 billion neurons, but only 17% of them are hooked up. But when the child looks into the mother's eyes and mother looks into the child's eyes, the child's nervous system starts reconfiguring itself. Its metabolic system, its cardiovascular system, its immune system. All of them are being co-created in relationship with the mother. And this is where the attachment people really had it right. Parents that are present, you're there, they're congruent, they're not feeling something, projecting something else. They're contingent, they're attuned to their kid, and they're marked. They're expressive enough to let the kid know. I know when, oh, you're mad? You notice how I just did that? An infant will know I'm not mad. I'm just pretending to be mad to let you know that you're mad. Okay. Those kids tend to be securely attached, and they're going to do better. If they're wired for personality disorders, they're going to do better, but they're still going to have to struggle with those personality disorders. So that's how it works. Okay. And I won't go into any more of the research, but it's just overwhelming research has supported what I just said. Okay. So that's now what this does is you go, okay, so now we have what superior parenting is. Now, once again, we're kind of missing who can provide that. Who can provide first of all, being firm, warm, flexible with their child and patient with their child. Now, you notice those are capacities that you can do at any value mean. But generally, the farther you go up the spiral, the more self-awareness you are. If you have a problem with one of those things, you're more likely to adjust it. If you can't see it, you're more likely to try to coerce your kid into adapting to you. Okay. So there's more coercion to adapt to my worldview. The lower down you go, and the later, as Bina would say, there's more capacity to self-observe and then adjust to the child until we get to the modern standard, which, by the way, is an evolutionary miracle. The modern standard is we find out who our child is and then adapt to helping that child thrive. Okay, that's a radical concept. That didn't even exist as a concept before like 80 years ago. And now, basically in the West, everybody just assumes it. This is why I'm hopeful about, development. It's a rising tide. Well, how does this apply to psychotherapy and to leadership research and to group intelligence? It tracks perfectly. We look at the effective leaders. What are the effective leaders? Firm, warm, flexible, and you add positive and resolved. All right? Again and again and again, those are the effective leaders. Who are the effective lovers? Boundaries, warmth, flexibility, intentionality. After the first couple of years, if you want to have a good love affair, you got to be intentional. intentionality and resolve, to resolve to make it work. Okay? Same with group intelligence. And now here we come to the final part of this, which is psychotherapy. Abigail and I were talking about this before we came on. I think that most really good psychotherapy happens when the therapist is functionally at a teal altitude. You know, felt appreciation from multiple points of view, ability to change directions at high velocity, a responsiveness, a commitment to helping somebody grow in every way. And what you do is you co-create a culture. And I mentioned this in my book on integral psychotherapy, Waking Up. Therapists and clients co-create a culture where the client and their worldview feel understood, supported, and where growth, better perspectives are considered beautiful, good, and true. The therapist maintains that container in the face of the client's defenses. So the defenses come up, defenses pull for complementary defenses. Therapists do not accommodate that. They go, no, I'm going to still understand you. I'm going to still connect with you, but I'm not going to create a complementary defense. Instead, I'm going to create a container that is drawing you from your defense into self-awareness and development. And this is horizontal and vertical development. This is how it happens. And if you're dealing with clients basically who are in a first tier moment or a defensive moment, you, as a therapist, always have a couple of conversations. You have, okay, what we're doing, and then below the surface, how far can I go before they break down? You know, there's always, you're always on that edge. And those of you that have worked individually, you find this. Marcella was a little bit pessimistic about businessmen in our last session. I think, Marcella, you probably had a bad group or something. I think they probably have more capacity than you give them credit for sometimes. But
it's not about the people, it's about the system.
About the system. Oh, there you go. And you know, as we know, life conditions create worldviews. And so in psychotherapy, you have these two conversations until somebody's at teal. I have clients where they're working at teal. And at that point, okay, it's one conversation. And if people stay in therapy, you kind of shift off of therapy at that point and you're kind of coaching them. And, you know, some people are doing that and then some weird thing will happen and then we're back into therapy. And then, you know, we're back to two conversations. The high functioning clients, when I go into the defenses, I can discuss the defenses. It's still one conversation, which is really fun therapy, but it's rare, right? And so I want to do this little exercise. Oh, good. So I'm going to try to be mindful of time. I want everybody to remember a group that they were in, which was, and I mean a specific meeting that was a spectacular group for you. You go, God, this is the greatest group ever today. You know, when was it? You can be the leader, you can be a participant, but just think about, God, that was a great group. Okay. So I want everybody to think about one. Kind of start nodding your head when you got one so that I can know we can move to the next thing. Okay, we got them. All right. Now, what are 2 or 3 words that describe that group? And write them down if you got a pencil. Two or three words that describe that group. Right? You know, 1 to 3 words. It can be more or less, but, you know, a few words. And now, what are 2 or 3 words that described your experience of that group? How's I feeling? How's I functioning? How is that? What's going on in me? Got it? All right. Okay, and now I want you to remember the worst group you were ever in. Worst group session ever. I don't have to think for a second. I know where mine is. And I'll tell you about it too. It was fucking horrible. So worst one ever, okay? Just kind of nod your head when you got one. Okay, Abigail's nodding her head. I remember that one. Okay, got it. So, 2 or 3 words that describe that worst group ever. And now, 2 or 3 words to describe your experience of that group. Okay, everybody got it? All right. So, who'd like to share their experience? Somebody. You know, either the best one. I actually can't think of a best one. I know how they feel. They feel joyful. They feel like God's there all the time, and something great happened. The worst one, I let myself be talked by this billionaire into doing a group with his family on a super yacht, like a month and a half after one of the sons had died. And I just should have said no, but I didn't. I said, sure. You know, I was arrogant. It's a narcissistic trait, obviously, which got hammered by this experience. And it was a nightmare group. People were started feeling good. They ended up feeling horrible. There was all kinds of material that was coming up. I only had 90 minutes with them. That was another mistake. I felt ashamed and also just kind of freaked out. They felt chaotic. I left going, that's the worst group I ever had. And it was out of tune. And the problem with that group was me. You know, I didn't set appropriate boundaries for Mr. Billionaire, you know, so, okay, Keith, blind spot. And so that never happened again. So, and anyway, that was my worst one. And my best one is, it's kind of like this one. A lot of people in a container, open to love and be loved, open to grow. You can feel it happening below the surface, like bubbling. Pretty great. Somebody else. Best, worst experience, and what's it like for you?
I can go.
Sure.
I think the worst was the first time I ever talked somebody into letting me teach. And it was like the first time I ever tried to say things out loud about what I had learned. And the group was had been learning much more sort of materialist, like a physical relationship to herbs. And I was talking about the like psycho-spiritual aspects of organs from Chinese medicine perspective. It was really a nightmare. Like they weren't interested, they were disengaged. The whole thing felt like it was like disintegrated. I was anxious. I mean, I was so freaking anxious because I had never done it before. Um, and I think it created when I started noticing their lack of interest, I think it pulled out sort of a more controlling force in me to like try to get people to care. Um, so that was that. I'll never forget that. Um, the best one, I'm just going with sort of recent best one. We were just teaching a coach training cohort, and they're just so engaged and inquisitive and interested, and they're asking like really precise questions at a very early time in their learning. Like when you say when or where instead of how, like what's that going to provoke in the client? Like I'm like, I don't fucking know. Like I didn't even know I said how. But anyway, it was just very alive, and I felt warm, and there was also a degree of firmness because if I didn't set boundaries, the entire module moment would be taken up by their questions, and we'd never get to anything that we needed, like other stuff we needed to get to. So there was a degree of um, feeling warm, and like you said, like God's there, just like love and presence, but also like, all right, only 3 more questions, and then now we're gonna go. And so there was a kind of a boundaried, gentle, loving boundary sort of place there.
I just want to point out firm, responsive,
Yeah.
flexible, positive, and resolved. Okay. There you go. That's the leader.
Mhm.
Diane Mushel Hamilton, at some international conference, gave us instructions in groups of 8 with people all over the world. Name what you're, from your, wherever you're from, what you're proud of about your country. So we went around the circle and we named it. Then name what you feel ashamed of. And we went around the circle and named it. And there was a German woman that said the Holocaust. And immediately it transformed all of us into our respective shadows. And we were crying together. None of us were even born for that. But it was very interesting because the temporal displacement that Barbara Max Hubbard used to talk about occurred. We were feeling ashamed for a previous generation. And there was a person that was Jewish in the group. It was amazing. The leadership was external. This group could handle that sensitivity itself. And I mean, you could feel it because the rest of the time we saw each other at the conference, we just kind of acknowledged, wow, we just did something incredibly powerful. Worst groups is as you anticipated, where there's weak leadership and people with unresolved pathology start to act out their anxiety and dominate the group. I don't need to tell you guys what that looks like. And there's no leadership to contain them or redirect them. And those groups, I just want to run from.
How do you deal with it? I mean, are you the leader in that group, or which one are you thinking of? Were you the leader of the group, or were you in the group and that was happening? Which
that
one
was happening? I wasn't leading.
Oh, God. And so you felt what?
It felt dangerous. I felt concerned for other people. I wanted to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get out because nobody was going to contain this person. And that's why I don't think Greens are great therapists for the same reason. That inclusivity and tolerance for nonsense is ridiculous.
Yeah, psychopathology has existence.
Yeah, I had an amazing experience back to still I was executive. We were working with our team, and then we kept working to create intimacy and vulnerability to the point that and then I remember specifically the first meeting we had where we are naming our projections on each other, saying how much envy, anger, jealousy we are creating into each other. I just remember it because it was so powerful, because at the same time we are saying it to each other from a place of love. We just groove in a totally different level, and the power of being transparent and then using it to collective doing was very, very powerful.
That was a good one. What's your worst one?
Yeah, so I have so many, but I mean, I just remembering in actually business decision to be made. So it was critical crisis moment. Everyone interrupting everyone, being aggressive, cursing, and the person with more power in the room just lost his mind, and then
Fritz Perls used to say that a Gestalt therapist is always in control because they never need to be in control. Okay. And so this is that democratic leader. Okay. That Kurt Lewin skated over. The point about it is that the democratic process, there needs to be a lens. There needs to be someone responsible for maintaining the container. Now, part of it, extra crazy, you keep personality disorders out of your groups if possible. And if they're in there, they need to be weeded out, or they need to be able to be sucked up into higher functioning, which both of those things can happen. But you see what happens when the stuff comes up and there isn't somebody to maintain the container, someone to provide that democratic leadership. Somebody else.
Well,
Well,
No, not just when you say democratic, what do you mean?
what I mean is Plato and Socrates had it right with the philosopher king. They said that's the best. Who is that? That's somebody with authority that sees everyone as a unique individual that they care about. And they're looking for what's healthy and unhealthy for that individual and how that works into the collective. And they're able and willing to set boundaries if necessary, but the boundaries always involve dealing with every individual from a position of deep understanding, deep respect, and deep care. And so the philosopher king then is maintaining a sense where people go, my opinion counts and matters in a way that feels fair to me. So in this case, it's not like, we're all electing stuff. It's democratic in the sense of the subjective sense of my opinion, my feelings, and what I think matters in a way that feels fair, whether people agree or disagree. That experience is a superior experience for a human being. Human beings, when given a chance, create these social forms. And when they have these social forms, they do better. And when they're doing worse, if we can create a social form like that, they will get healthy in it. In Finland, this is how they treat schizophrenia. They go to a hospital, take everybody in, care for them, but don't let them act out. If they need meds, they give it to them, but then they just pay attention. Everybody has work to do. There's firm leadership, but also everybody matters. Then eventually they're weaned off of their meds and they're found jobs and stuff, and they have a phenomenal success rate. We can't do that in the United States because it would cost $200,000 a year per person to do that in the United States. And in Finland, they got a sane, healthcare system, but it's exactly the same thing. Now, I haven't seen any studies of the developmental altitudes of their practitioners, and I would like to see those. Kind of hard because not many people think in terms of developmental altitudes. But I suspect that generally it'll be a teal. That's my suspicion.
Now, I'm just asking because, using democratic or democracy to group organizations is always tricky because democracy implies that 51% wins, and then you leave the minority out. So
that's not what I'm talking about. It's the same word, but it's a different process, Marcelo.
I know. That's why anyway.
It's confusing. I'm sorry.
No, it's not confusing, but from the place, I love the work. Exactly what you're saying. There's this paradox of, in one hand, people don't question that they belong, and at the same time, they feel that they have a voice, even if they bring a different voice for the rest of the group. So how do you hold both at the same time? And it is powerful, right?
Well, and the criterion is the left quadrant criterion. Does it feel fair if it doesn't go my way? If it feels fair when it doesn't go my way, that's a subjective experience of being in a democratic environment. If it feels fair. And if you're not extra crazy, it's going to feel fair if it's being managed in that fashion. If you're extra crazy or if you're just actually triggered into something, maybe not. But then in that kind of environment, those people get, when I was teaching in Brazil, if there's somebody that was particularly distressed, they got extra attention from us until they began to feel like they were understood, included, and listened to and responded to. And it wasn't okay to not have that happen. It just, you need to feel understood, cared about, and responded to. That was the standard of that group. And that was 80 people were there, 60 people? I was very impressed with that. Anyway. That was a democratic group in that sense because people had that subjective sense. I matter, I care, I'm cared about.
Yeah, I was a wilderness guide for many years. And so when I think about a group, it's not just sitting down with a group of people for an hour or two or whatever. I'm talking about traveling with groups of people through the wilderness for a long time together. And I have a lot of best groups. I was in this one program where we were really out in the boonies and they'd have to drop our food with parachutes. We're so far out there. And my co-guide said, "Oh, John, you can handle this." He owned the company, so he left me out there. It was totally illegal, but anyway. So, and these rich kids, poor kids, just angry kids, and I said, I'm in over my head. I can't do this by myself. I'm gonna have to deputize everybody. We're not gonna survive, gentlemen or ladies. It's a mixed group, and it worked really well. These angry, awful teenagers turned into really responsible people that cared about the group. They felt really empowered. They knew I wasn't faking it, trying to make them feel like they knew they were really there. And at one point, we went up into this canyon system that was sent up there, and you climb in, but you can't climb out. So you have to keep going forward. And we had to do some technical rock climbing to get our asses out of there. That was scary as hell. We had no ropes. And it was like, I don't particularly like heights, but when you're in the leader, you can't just go, whoa, you just have to fake it. And and I just remember this one kid who we were in this really sketchy situation. And there was this big rock and down, 100, 150-foot fatal drop. And this had an abusive father and all this stuff. And we were going around this rock and finally he'd been so angry, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and I reached out and he grabbed my hand, and we pulled each other out of there in that situation. And it was just like, bam, so incredibly beautiful. And then when we finally all survived out of there, there's some new angry kids that came in, and they hadn't have a chance. The group was so functional and so working together and had so much love and respect for each other that it's just, it tears me up to feel. I felt happy. I felt proud. I felt meaningful. I mean, that I had a purpose in life and I was helping people, and, I wasn't spinning my wheels. Felt great. And I've been in some really dysfunctional groups. Oftentimes I'd be sent into a group that was falling apart. Oh, there was one incident where this counselor, this guide, said, "I figured it out, John. I know how to lead a perfect group. I've got it down." And I just kind of rolled my eyes and said, "Okay, brother, good luck." And he ended up getting duct taped to a tree, and all students ran off. He was like, "John, I did everything." I know that's the way it goes. But I've been really sent into groups that are really angry and pissed off, and it's usually because of bad leadership. And it erupted into violence. And I had a friend of mine who was, I loved him, but he was like, lacked some leadership skills or something, very pedantic. And he got in front of these angry young men and started to blah, 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 blah. And anyway, he was assaulted. And, I had to grab the guy that was attacking him. And that really helped. Once that was done, it was like, we got to act that out. And so, okay, this is real. All right. There's some constraints here. And it turned it around. But that feeling of being powerless and anger, and, I didn't do it. I'm just trying to help here, but I'm not going to be bullied either, Anyway, I just felt the chaos of groups like that. And sometimes the violent eruption was what actually was needed, for somebody to be held and controlled and know that it was, it was going to be okay.
So once again, you see that the absence of firmness, the absence of responsiveness, the absence of flexibility, the absence of resolve, in certain environments creates problems. And when you look at the problems, you're not talking about basically the participants as much. You're talking about the person who's responsible for holding the container not having one of those capacities. Okay?
Yep.
And this is the power of psychotherapy. I think anybody who works with people is a psychotherapist, myself. And I think there's just various levels that you do it. This is what humans, given a chance to be in this kind of environment with this kind of leaders, thrive, right? We grow, and then we grow more, and then we grow more, and then we grow more. We have the neural territory to do it. And that's the magic. That's the magic of change work in general, psychotherapy in particular. And it runs off of these these principles that apply to all human stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Can I amplify something John said?
sure.
Is it wasn't always the dialectic, though. It was the
Of course not.
experiential process of catharting that level of feeling, and that he created a container that was able to transmute it into, more of a unified purpose. So, I mean, we love the dialectic, but it's not going to always work. I think, am I saying that right, John?
Yeah, I think that's really
Well, of course. Remember, dialectic only works when both people are at an altitude and unobstructed. When one person isn't, at least in these environments, the other person has a responsibility to manage that situation optimally. Now, that's psychotherapy. Psychotherapy, whatever altitude somebody comes in, whatever, like that couple were blowing up yesterday. Neither one of them were. I wasn't doing a dialectic with that couple, except certain moments it happened. And when it did, I supported it. But when it wasn't there, I was being a good parent. I was being firm. I was setting boundaries. When I'm working with a couple, I will interrupt them 60 times in 60 minutes. You know, why? For obvious reasons. Now, that's not the dialectic. That's me doing my job. But then when it's happening, fine. We can go in the group. It's just my job to do it. This is why I can't stand leaderless groups. I have an antipathy to leaderless groups. I have a reaction because they seem dangerous to me.
I wanted to offer an observation because the negative experiences seem to be often when we're in groups where the leader is either leading terribly or is just not leading. So it's I think our worst experiences, and I mean, we haven't had all our worst experiences. I know for me, it was when someone who had the most power, but it was an equal, or we thought it was an equal group, pulled the plug and basically did a huge betrayal. And everyone else is stunned and shocked. So it wasn't a lack of, well, there was definitely a lack of warmth, though, but it was almost like a personality, like a two-faced personality disorder thing that came up in the person who had the most power. So I find that interesting because it's sometimes you think something's going to be going on and then something completely different happens and the whole thing falls apart, but you're not. And I heard, the different examples, we're not in the position, or Marcella, where you say the CEO loses his mind. You're not in a position to do much about it. You'd have to rearrange everything to have a different container and a different agreement of who's actually leading and guiding. So I just wanted to point out that.
I want to make a point about that, then Alexander, and then John. The point I want to make, 12 months old, 13 months old, when a child does something wrong, screws up, the parent disapproves of the child in some fashion, and the child freezes, experiences a shame emotion. And basically, all their physiological responses are as if the parent turned into a stranger. Now, the parent, when the kid freezes and stops doing the thing, goes, oh, we're back. The kid will go back to happy sympathetic arousal. We are wired to be horrified when we feel like somebody shifts from a safe person to an unsafe person. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. And I'm sure those things were activated in that group.
I'm going to say that often when I was out in these groups that, my father's generation was called the greatest generation. And my father was definitely representative of that. He was heroic, humble, was a great man. I loved him dearly. I still do, and I miss him. But I remember thinking, man, these kids, they're the greatest generation. These angry, obnoxious, pissed off, drug-using, school-skipping, rebellious kids, they just turned into these wonderful human beings. And it just, my God, if they just have the right flower pot, if they have the right container, they're all the greatest generations. And this made me feel really bad that we can't provide more of that. And the thing about wilderness itself, it won't do it alone. It could turn into Lord of the Rings. I mean, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Flies. I'm sorry. It could be Lord of the Rings too. The Lord of the Flies. It could just turn into this chaotic, psychopathic nightmare, or it can turn something real, not made up consequences, true consequences, us working together in the reality of the natural and incredible, dangerous, scary, beautiful, pure world. And that does something absolutely amazing. And these kids would just wake up and turn into something that's like, you just want to bow before them. And yeah, that.
Yeah, I'm loving all this discussion, and it brings up questions for me around some of the things I've seen that younger sort of, in Terry's model, meta-aware folks, or we might say construct-aware folks, that they're playing with this territory of what does it mean to be a leader in a collective. And because there's so much natural developmental interest in dissolving boundaries, there's a way in which they'll play with leadership not having the typical I'm the leader leading the group kind of role. And I've seen it produce really cool things. And then I've also seen it sort of flop because there's no one knows who's leading. But on the other, I just wanted to bring it up because I'm here. I think I'm hearing a sort of a sense of, well, turquoise or later, like they're going to be able to kind of do this firm, flexible, all of these things. And I think that can be true, especially, with like Terry's 4.5 sort of integral stage, which has a kind of principled stand that they're taking. But I've also seen, once that construct awareness and that dissolution starts to occur, some really interesting choices. Now, granted, a lot of the folks I've seen play with this are also kind of young too. So they're playing, there's the construct dissolution and there is youngness that's all sort of flowing into the same space and the same being. I don't really have a complete sentence with it, but it's just interesting to kind of step into some of these more sort of later stage collectives and see all sorts of wonky things happen where boundaries are falling apart. And there's a lot to say about it, but one of the things I notice is that because those fifth person perspective stages, their collective is still the fourth person collective. And if they don't have a strong principled 4.5, they tend to have a very loosey-goosey green that's sort of, but with this like magnitude of deconstruction all over the place. And so the whole thing kind of goes into this wonky, boundaryless, let's deconstruct everything. Like we're going to take a stand and we're going to deconstruct it before we even have a chance to take a stand. And then everything gets very strange and interesting. So anyway, I have more the like, I'm gonna like let's lead, like let's like, and so it's been interesting to be in some collectives where, I'm following them trying something new, and it's interesting.
I mean, there's so much we're talking about here. We're kind of, in a sense, maybe just a brief pause of reflection is like shifting contexts, and there's a lot of different topics at play, which I enjoy, lots of richness. Alexander, I think we've shared some of those contexts, and I've seen some of those challenges, and I think one of the pieces is possibly at play is, as you mentioned, is some of these folks they're younger folks, and so there's a certain kind of life experience that is needing to perhaps accumulate. But I just, a couple of things I wanted to point to. I mean, one is it's part of the territory of the work that we're in, which is to support a kind of healthy and whole collectives and individuals, such that leadership is a function of the collective. It's not something that resides in a particular individual necessarily, and can be a fluid process. But it's and in that kind of a group, there is a leadership function, but it's not held. It's not held by an individual, and that itself is a process that a group, of course, needs to mature into. It's something that I think we have to sort of try and fail at many times to discover some of the magic that John, I heard you speak to, and others are pointed to in those positive experiences. And and one thing that in our work where we have the facilitators are providing that leadership function to support the group to stabilize that for themselves, and there's a point at which the facilitators sort of we're increasingly supporting the group to own its own process, and also there's a point where we step away. And we just finished the 4th retreat with in this 4-retreat program, and I witnessed something in one of the cohorts that I've seen happen repeatedly, which is we step out of the room and what happens is conflict, and that's seems to be it's an inherent part of the process. And it's not, does the conflict arise or not arise, it's how does the group lean in the face of that conflict. But it seems to be a natural part of reestablishing kind of how we're going to be together, how we're going to function as a group. But I just feel a real profound and rich potential in the leadership function being a function of the collective, so shifting out of the mode of an individual holding that role, and maybe like an individual holding that role as a transitional structure to the point that the collective can hold that and be more fluid in its relationship to it.
Don't you have a function? Doesn't the buck stop with somebody? I mean, I think leaders don't always lead, but if you're the person where the buck stops, if ultimately it all goes to hell, you're going, okay, I need to start taking care of it. I mean, don't you have that? Even if you step away, isn't there somebody where if it goes far enough afield, somebody goes, okay, the buck stops with me in terms of addressing it? Doesn't that always exist to some extent? Is it, or maybe not? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, personally, I mean, I don't know. In a sense, that's like I just want to hold that as a question, really.
Yeah, okay.
Because something I witness in these groups, and this is just it's a practice field. Let's say it's experimental. Is then that function might be held by an individual, and or parts of it might be held by multiple individuals. So I can think about with this specific group, I was just describing something of what I witnessed happening in this group, and it is one person was holding a kind of deeper ground of equanimity and presence, and were able to, like in the face of conflict, help the group kind of come to this place of acceptance of what is. So they were holding that function. And then there was another person that was holding this kind of almost shamanic function of creating this sort of loving challenge, being very truthful, but also loving at the same time. So seeing that there was kind of functions that people held, and not that they were fixed for those individuals, but they had those qualities that they could bring in perhaps more readily than another might. Anyway, I'm holding these things as a question in the sense of us exploring what's possible in our own collective evolution. And so, yes, I think, yes, it helps. I think sometimes it's necessary to have somebody, the buck stops with somebody, but just holding this as a inquiry.
Yeah. Question.
Well, also, you're presupposing to a certain extent somebody's construct aware.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
The person with the deepest consciousness functionally has the most responsibility. Okay, so if I'm construct aware and other people aren't, and things are going weird, then I need to make an adjustment. So part of it just has to do with depth. And I think that's a very important variable.
I had the experience of running my company with self-management principles from holacracy, and then I have been implementing holacracy or sociocracy for the last 10 years, which I think I agree with you, Abigail, that the leadership is more and more collective. So when the principles behind it, it is that no one holds the last word in a group. So you have to find a way to decide based on commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, just running my own business and helping clients implementing holacratic or sociocratic principles, it is very clear that although we decide collective, there is no one single person with the last word. Power dynamics is still there. So people are influencing each other. There's people that has more depth of conscience than the other. So the power is there. And then, in my perspective, there are two very important assumptions to make those self-management works work. One is who has more power in the systems must be willing to shift power down, or must be willing to bring the power down. And more important than the first one is people receiving power must be mature enough to hold the responsibility for having power. It is very interesting that every time that we implement the self-management structures, at least 30% of people ask to leave because they say, you know what? I don't want to be part of this. I just want to have a job. I don't want to be, I want to be to hold responsible. And that's where a lot of initiatives implementing self-management fail because one, they don't create enough context to people to mature because at the end of the day, it's easier to project out authority outside of ourselves. So because it's just blaming someone, it is more comfortable that hold responsibility for the decisions that need to be made. And second, there must be enough psychological safety. There must be a trust container to the decisions to be made to the point of being collective. So
I would say that it depends. Leadership depends on being integral leadership, construct aware, knowing what your group needs. Sometimes you need somebody to just get up, organize things, tell people what to do. That provides safety, structure. It's exactly what they need. Other times it doesn't work. In other words, Gandhi, for example, would not have been very good working opposing Adolf Hitler. You know, you needed more of a Winston Churchill there, but it worked really good with the British Empire because they were at that level where they really loved him. You know, the public thought he was a really good guy, and it really led to the peaceful revolution where India won its independence because of the developmental level of these two systems. So to be a good leader, you have to know when to be strong. You have to know when to let go. You have to know when to deputize and share responsibility and let go of share responsibility or take responsibility. And it all just depends on what the situation is and what you're trying to do and who are the individuals.
I'd like to
I'd like to hear from Namali. So Namali, I get curious. When you don't talk, I want to know what you're thinking and what your reaction. I want your worst group and best group. Namali, come on. What's the Namali?
For me, the best groups and the worst groups have pretty much been all in this integral world, I think, for the most part. Because it's funny, me living here as an immigrant without much family and all that, my participation living in Boulder has almost always been within these integral domains. I almost don't know any communities outside of the integral community. And so that's where I've had some of the best experiences as well as the worst experiences. But what is intriguing to me is on this topic of leadership and some of the qualities and the polarities like flexibility and structure. I mean, first of all, leadership as a conversation is just one of the oldest conversations around. And within the integral world also, how long have we been having this integral leadership seminars, and the conversation has been going on forever. And something that is always intriguing to me is that as we evolve, if development is actually true in the way that we often talk about it in the integral communities and developmentally aware groups, is that we are deconstructing as we evolve. More and more, our sense of ourself is what we actually learn to let go. And that's a function of development. And as a function of development, I think the double-edged sword in that is also that as the self disappears, it also loses its need to show up as a leader. It's just like this spiritual reality that enters as a part of evolution, this sense of dissolving our sense of self. And without that, stepping into that leadership role requires so much of taking in from orange and taking in from blue, and then having to have the discourse of green, and all that can be just so exhausting for integral, I think. And it's just this double-edged sword of what integral leadership means that I'm certainly really aware of. And I think it's a tug of war for those of us in these kinds of spaces, which is also why I think at a larger scale, the gooder people, as Ken used to say, there's the good and then there's the gooder. The gooder people are not the ones who are stepping into to run an election and run for office. And so we're kind of still stuck with first-tier leaders, or having to let go of our integral needs and just fully embrace first-tier needs and go with that in order to really lead. And then for those of us in maybe integral spaces, bumping into walls within that. And, just running the integral center here with Jeff, I remember, we're thinking we're running an integral center, but then it's like, there'll be women who come and complain. Why is it always Jeff who's leading? And it's like, why aren't there more female leaders? Or there's always like complaints that come up. And then we think that, but we're an integral center, so we're doing things differently. And then you find out, well, nobody's showing up anymore. So all I'm saying is that I think integral leadership is a conundrum, because it forever is battling with this need to show up and also an inherent desire to dissolve. And I'm not really here.
Yeah, I gotta say, I always super enjoy your distaste for bullshit. The Namali distaste for bullshit is just, I don't know why that's relaxing. It's relaxing. And the other thing is, I'm realizing as we talk, I know so little about organizations, so little about, these multiple things. Obviously, because I've avoided it all my life, but also, and I think this is one of the reasons that I have. It's why Almas told John, I could never run for office. He realized that there were kind of compromises of consciousness that he didn't want to go to. He was into keeping the purity of his thing, and the ambiguities that we're talking about and the patience that's required. He just said, that's not for me. That's not my path. I'm kind of identifying a little bit with that right now. Because boy, I'm just feeling a lot of stuff I don't know anything about, or very little about, frankly, organizations, that kind of stuff.
I wanted to just say one other thing. I think integral leadership is so much about this little term that I've coined, and I'm running sessions on this topic now at Integral Life, is what I'm calling interstage dialogue. And that is the idea of translation. So it's, Wilbur has talked about translation versus transformation, and leadership as fully just being willing to meet other value means where they're at, and really us having to let go of our ideas of being integral and all that, and rather as a full-on required skill of being integral, needing to have these interstage dialogues with other stages, and again dissolving of my needs often, and being able to really speak to blue. And how do we do that? So I'm talking about skills like steel manning and titanium manning, which is a concept that came from Ryan Nakadi, who used to run meta-ideological politics. Polarity, polarities, doing the shadow work, and all these things of really having to let go in many ways of our needs. But then the conundrum is always there of us still existing in this relative human body.
I'd like to ask a question. So to those of us remaining here, is there anything that you're thinking or opinion you have or a judgment you have that you're not sharing right now? Because, I don't want to offend anybody or, anybody? Something. John, you got something you're keeping.
Yeah, a lot of times I think integral leadership is just green masquerading as integral, and it's just a mess. So that was my thought that came up when you were speaking, Molly.
Yeah, I think that's bad integral leadership.
Mhm.
I have a perspective I'd like to share. It's not, I don't think it's contrarian, but I also want to say I really resonate in my own bones with what Namali you're saying, and also Keith too, of just avoiding the systems in myself. And is that having a cost, But one thing we haven't looked too much at is instead of the leadership, the group itself and who's coming to the group and their motivations. So I think I'm interested in a dynamic interplay in how much skin in the game participants have for certain things. And that if they don't have skin in the game, or we don't have skin in the game for a certain thing, then, and I was thinking, I worked in wilderness for 13 years too, John, and it wasn't at wilderness therapy. It was more like wilderness, guiding and group process. But the skin in the game is what you talked about. It's sort of you're forced to get along in a situation where there are absolute limits, in this case, the natural world. And if you don't do it, you're going to be ousted in some way, or you're going to be. And so I'm into this skin in the game. Nicholas Nassim Taleb, great book. This idea that so many of us show up for things half-heartedly, and in a sense, it's the leadership's responsibility to, in some way, charismatically or have something excellent to offer that we would want. But I think it's an interesting way to flip it a little for me, and looking at the group itself and what people's motives are for arriving. Because if we don't all arrive for kind of the same thing, then I think we have trouble.
100%.
It's been delightful for me to just listen and witness and hear the diversity of perspectives. I noticed, Keith, just an appreciation for you doing the research that you're doing and bringing that forward. I also noticed I could feel in myself like a dual movement. One is to be drawn to the certainty, and another is to challenge the certainty. And that's that's just an interesting thing to notice. And I just want to echo. It's like, just even, I'm in the context of teaching this class on applied integral leadership, and leadership itself as just our constructs around it are so, they feel, like you said, old in a way, Namali. They feel distorting. They feel complex and subtle to navigate. So that's an interesting dilemma. I would say the class is ready to let go of the term leadership and are trying to, trying to reconstruct that. So that's some of the range. I also noticed, this will be my last thing. This is kind of personal. I noticed, kind of almost like the pattern of my own development that can show up when I come into a new group. Like I can come in feeling shy and a little bit doubtful, and then just find my own ground and enjoy delight in the unfolding.
I'm left just with this curiosity. It's an ongoing curiosity around this sense of leadership, because we are each leaders of our own lives. And I end up mostly examining my own leadership in my own life, and often how disappointed I am. Yeah. And then also again, I think what I brought up, I'm also just left feeling this conundrum of, but there's also this relaxation. What if this is it as it is? So yeah, thank you.
I'm interested in the topic, and really just interested in my limits and I'm I'm interested in my lack of interest in leadership, actually. It's I haven't been interested in leadership in a long time, and I used to be very interested. So I'm just curious what's coming online for me and for us. It's really, I feel a togetherness in this, so it's nice.
I'm just really glad to be here. My default pattern is to never stop working, and there's a way that coming to this group, it's like it just forces me to hang out with people I love and, not like keep doing things. And Keith, it's like I notice every time anybody says something that you don't know about, I see you like write it down, and I'm like, I think he reads every book that everybody mentions all the time. And because of that disposition in a human being, I love to just learn from you because you're drawing from all of these different places, and I don't particularly like reading. And so it's like to hear your like you're giving like your digested gift, like if you've taken in all this stuff. And so I really appreciate that. And so I'm just, for me, I'm just glad to be here with all of you. And yeah.
Well, Chad, Alexander, I feel really part of this group, and that always feels good. And I brought some stuff in with me, issues, anger at this person or fear and blah, blah, blah. And I just I feel more space around everything. I feel better. I think, okay, presence, I guess is the word. I feel presence.
I really enjoyed the conversation today, and I'm intrigued. Everybody has had a reaction, which is pretty great. I would think about taking your reaction and your opinion and presenting next month. Let's all look at each other. Let's all get connected. Let's all feel each other. Let's feel the container, feel the aliveness, the lively awareness, as Daniel P. Brown used to say. Just feel it. Feel the love and power and wisdom of us together. Feel it like a bubble around us. Feel that bubble expand, getting stronger as it expands and expands to heal the world. And I'll see you guys next month. Really looking forward to John presenting. Thank you, John.
Uh-huh.
Much love to everybody.